unquote, another as, quote, a masterpiece. I eagerly await his next book project, Once the Only True Austrians, focusing on memoirs penned by Jewish Austrians and Austrians persecuted as Jews under National Socialism who emigrated or fled to the United States during the 20th century. If I begin to name all of his articles, essays, and chapters, we will only finish in 2027. So I will just note his editing of very fine issues of the Journal of Austrian Studies and the Journal for the Association of Jewish Studies in Germany, where he co-edited an essay on Jewish and Muslim histories in Austria. I am proud to be part of a working group with Tim, where we will both contribute to a volume of Central Europe focused on contradictory modernism in Eastern Europe. For today's talk, Tim will share with us some of his findings and reflections related to his current project as researcher for the Austrian Academy of Sciences on anti-Semitic discourses in online media and their reception among Jews in Austria. Please give him a hearty welcome.
All right. Hello. Thank you very much. I would just like to extend my thanks to Laura for inviting me here to talk to you today. It's a great honor to come all the way over to talk about this topic. And I'm going to dive straight in because we have a lot to cover. So. Okay. So polls have for years now been showing the widespread and consistent anti-Semitic attitudes among the general population in Austria, as well as in other countries. The most common manifestations of anti-Semitism these days are a belief in a worldwide Jewish conspiracy, the idea that Jews are puppet masters who control governments, media, banks, and corporations. There are widespread racist tropes of Jews as alien people, as a separate people who are loyal only to each other or to the state of Israel, or of Jews as being inherently duplicitous, greedy, destructive, and corrupt. These views can be found in all social groups, regardless of age, gender, educational background, cultural or religious background, or political orientation. Though, and this is important, the expression or the form of anti-Semitism does vary from different groups. So to give an example, among the right wing, you might hear the term cultural Marxists being used, this idea that Jews are people who undermine traditional values. And on the left, you might hear people talking about Jews as powerful capitalists, imperialists, and warmongers. Notably, though, these same polls that I'm referring to, they usually reveal quite a widespread overlap between anti-Semitic attitudes and other forms of hate. So to name a few, like xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and misogyny, and more generally, a tendency to depict authoritarian personalities, a tendency to believe conspiracy theories. This is a very important point. I'll come back to this later in the talk, but these things do tend to coalesce. And notably, even before the attacks on October 7th, anti-Semitic discourse, like discourse on anti-Semitism, I'll explain that in a minute, revolved increasingly around the Middle East conflict and Israel. And not surprisingly, then that will be quite a strong focus of my talk today. So just a quick aside, I use the word discourse. What do I mean by this? So thinking here of also the students in the room. So discourse basically concerns how ideas and viewpoints are constructed. So what you mean is how people construct their views of the world through language and through interaction with other people, right? So different groups of people talk to each other and together they kind of co-construct worldviews and value systems. And this is basically how individuals also formulate political positions and opinions concerning current events. So for example, through reading newspapers, obviously, then discourse is very strongly affected by politics and media, and to some degree by academia, though you can debate how much influence we actually have. Since October 7th, the discourse on Israel has become a lot more polarized than it already was to begin with. To cite some extreme views, you might hear people claiming on the one side that Zionism is a racist ideology, a form of Western imperialism, and that Israel is an illegitimate settler colonial state. And on the other side, you might hear the view that any and all criticism of Israel or Israeli policies, so including settlement construction or violence in the occupied territories, discriminatory citizenship laws, or even the conduct of the war in Gaza and Lebanon currently, that this is merely motivated by anti-Semitism. So part of the reason for this polarization that we see of this debate at the moment is very clearly a problem of social media as well, which tend to push very reductive content. Media scientists call this an algorithmic radicalization. I think a lot of people will be aware of this, even implicitly by using social media. You all know what clickbait is. Social media functions by triggering moral outrage in people. It's also a widespread platform for spreading disinformation and conspiracy narratives, and all of this has come to a big head since October 7th. But there's also a problem in this context of definition, right? So as I've mentioned, there are many different forms of anti-Semitism. It's quite difficult to actually objectively define or quantitatively measure in every case what is anti-Semitic. And then, of course, there are implicit political agendas at play. So when you follow sort of quite radical pro-Israel or pro-Palestine positions, these are often actually being mobilized for domestic concerns like winning votes or virtue signaling that don't actually have anything to do with the conflict. The consequence is a strong competition of narratives, right? So again, this discourse idea, you have an instrumentalization of anti-Semitism in these debates and a deliberate polarization of different social groups against each other. So in this talk today, I will focus on this interview project that I conducted with a colleague with Jewish Austrians and their views on anti-Semitism and these related discourses in present-day Austria. But first, because I'm speaking to an American audience, I will address the question of why Austria. So Austria, in case you don't know, is a small country. It has a population of around 9 million people. That's the population of New York City. And it has a Jewish population of about 8 to 15,000, depending on how you define Jewish. That's 0.1% of the population, right? So it's a very, very small population group. Notably, the country has about 100 times as many Muslims. That's about 10% of the population. And that is significant for this issue of sort of instrumentalization and polarization that I'm talking about today. Austria was historically home to a much larger Jewish population, but also has a very long history of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic ideology, which is also very crucial in this context. So obviously home to a lot of senior Nazis, not least of all Adolf Hitler, who planned and executed the Holocaust, which is the targeted genocide of Jewish people in Europe. So Austria had this huge and very influential Jewish population that was almost entirely destroyed in the Holocaust. And not surprisingly, this memory of the Holocaust is really central to this small surviving remnant of Jews in the country today. And moreover, given the enormity of the Holocaust, this event is crucial to the politics of history in Austria. So if you compare that, much like slavery or settler colonialism is very central to American politics of history, that is kind of the equivalent in Austria as the Holocaust. So, and already pointing to this fact that you have these divergent politics of history or different historical events that have these huge gravity in different countries, that's also very important to these anti-Semitism debates. And you'll notice then that the way these debates run in Austria, the way they run in the United States or in other countries are different as a result of this. And I will come back to this later. You may have heard the term multi-directional memory. I'll come back to that later. That is relevant in this context. Moving into the present day, there is still a very strong anti-Semitic and even neo-Nazi sort of trend in the country today. There is a very widespread support for the far right. We just had an election 2 weeks ago and the far right won a landslide, which is very worrying. Here is a picture of a campaign badge for the head of the Freedom Party, who this guy particularly, he calls himself the Volkskanzler, that's the People's Chancellor. That's a term that was used by Hitler. So this is a, very clear dog whistle, and it's not coincidental. This is a party that was founded by former Nazis after the war, and its members are constantly embroiled in scandals over making Nazi statements, displaying Nazi symbols. The party entertains extremely close connections, not only with outspoken anti-Semites, but also rabid racists. So again, you have this coalescence of different forms of hate that come together in this group. And here you have a wonderful picture. Oh, I just realized Can I remove that somehow? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a picture of the head of this party at his party, his election party, just 2 weeks ago. As you can see, he was very pleased with himself. And the man he's standing with is Tim Ziegler. He is an activist of the band Identitarian Movements. I don't know if you've heard of them. They are very radical right wing. And he's making a gesture there that is a very widely recognized white supremacy gesture. This guy just won the Austrian elections, I'm just saying. But very important to mention, that their platform is extremely racist, but they are also constantly embroiled in these anti-Semitism scandals. So you really have this confluence of these different issues here, which I will come back to. And I want to note at this point that the identitarians, who are such close buddies with these people, they're also very close to extremely violent movements. So if you remember the Christchurch massacre in 2019, when somebody massacred over 50 people in 2 mosques in New Zealand, that perpetrator had direct connections with the Austrian identitarians. So there we go. So that's Austria. It's a former Nazi state with a very widespread problem of far-right extremism. And this explains why anti-Semitism, among other topics, is actually very central to political discourse today and takes on a very particular role or a very particular form that you really need to sort of have this historical background in mind when you then see the way that Austrians talk about anti-Semitism. There has, in fact, been a seismic shift in the discourse and in policy in recent years, as I'm going to highlight now. The Austrian government has implemented numerous policies targeting anti-Semitism in recent years. So, for example, in 2016, they adopted the so-called IRA definition of anti-Semitism. I'm afraid I don't have time to go into all the details of this today, but you can look up the debates yourself. They began commissioning biennial surveys that study the prevalence of anti-Semitism since 2018, and in 2021 implemented the so-called National Strategy Against Anti-Semitism. That includes, among other things, funding research into anti-Semitism. And in fact, this project that I conducted is one of the results of this research initiatives. So each one of these initiatives I've just shown was spearheaded by the Austrian People's Party, right? Not the Freedom Party, but the People's Party. They're a conservative party, sort of moderate right, at least they used to be, but they've become in recent years increasingly populist and have started adopting elements of the hard right, and probably in that sense, not entirely uncomparable to the Republican Party in the United States. So the initiatives were initiated by the People's Party, but usually in coalition with the far-right Freedom Party. So right here on the left, you have Sebastian Kurz. Some of you might remember him. He was the chancellor a few years ago. He's really pushed this sort of anti-Semitism initiative of the Austrian government, and also has completely reshifted Austrian foreign policy to become extremely pro-Israel. And at the same time, here he is with his vice chancellor at the time from the Freedom Party, who has close ties to the far right and to neo-Nazi movements, and promotes, among other things, the anti-Semitic Great Replacement theory. You might have heard of that. I will come back to it later. Both of these men are since disgraced and under corruption investigations, which is not untypical for the far right. But the policies of their parties continue pretty much in exactly the same vein as they initiated them. So the People's Party are currently in coalition with the Freedom Party in 3 out of 9 federal states in Austria, and we'll see where the coalition talks take us in the next few weeks. It's very likely that they will come back into power again. So you might see why I'm telling you all of this already, is that there is a bit of a paradox here, and that's putting it kindly, right? That you have this sort of what looks on the surface like quite a positive sort of policy of targeting anti-Semitism, and sort of wrapping this up and being sort of very staunchly like allied to the state of Israel and making this central to the government program, while at the same time cooperating with the far right and adopting the program, especially regarding immigration, Islam, and refugee politics. I will say in this context that the policies themselves have also been the subject of a lot of criticism. So the IRA definition is extremely contested, not just in Austria, but in the United States as well. There are concerns that it criminalizes free speech, specifically regarding Israeli policy. The surveys that have been conducted have employed very problematic definitions and have also been seen to sort of target Muslims, that they sort of try through ostensibly scientific means to sort of prove a narrative that is pushed by the government that anti-Semitism is a problem that is imported into Austria by Muslims. And finally, the national strategy has been criticized because while it was EU mandated, so different EU member states were encouraged to adopt such strategies, they were also encouraged to adopt similar strategies against racism. And in Austria, repeated governments have simply refused to do that. So there is a clear attempt to sort of disentangle the issues, focus on anti-Semitism, and just completely disentangle it from the related problems of xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia, and so on. So the public discourse, right? That's everything that's like politicians talking about these issues, the media talking about these issues, academics to an extent as well, is very much dominated by non-Jews, interestingly enough, in a country where Jews make up a really tiny minority, and is often very sensationalized. So this is, I'm just gathering my thoughts. I'm getting to the end of this section. Okay, so the result of the fact that so much public discourse is really dominated by non-Jewish voices means that you have a lot of academic theory discussions, you have a very clear political instrumentalization of the topic, and media, to an extent, sensationalization of the topic of quote-unquote anti-Semitism that actually largely ignores the real experiences of the people who are affected by it, which is Jewish people, obviously. So that brings me to a summary of our project very quickly. We conducted this over the past 2 years at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And for this reason of what I have just shown, we decided to focus very specifically on Jewish perspectives to see, okay, divorced from these sort of broader political debates, what do Jewish people actually think? So our primary data was basically consisted of interviewing Jewish Austrians on a broad range of questions relating to the issue of anti-Semitism itself, but also this sort of public discourse. So in the time I have remaining, I'm going to focus on the following key questions, which really also follow the narrative logic of the interviews that we conducted. Namely, how did the interviewees experience anti-Semitism day to day, and especially in the context of kind of social media and online debates? How do they perceive the public discourse, right? So how anti-Semitism is talked about in the senses I outlined above? And finally, how do they see anti-Semitism corresponding to the discourse relating to other forms of hate and discrimination? So just a short note on the interviewees themselves. That was quite a small number, 17 people that we interviewed, yet they did reflect quite a broad spectrum of the Jewish population in Austria. So we had a balance of men and women. Their ages ranged from under 18 to over 80. We had people with religious views ranging from secular to liberal to conservative to orthodox, political views from left to right or unaligned, and backgrounds from people who were native to Austria to people who were recent immigrants, though all the people we interviewed were members of the official Jewish community organization in Austria. Having said all of that, we decided to anonymize all of our sources to protect the identity of our interviewees. We thought this is crucial because it really is quite a sensitive topic. But it does mean that some sort of sociological information does go missing. So basically, when you have a certain viewpoint, you'll see certain quotes. I'm afraid I can't sort of interpret those against the background of the person speaking, which is often very relevant, but okay. But a key takeaway in any case is that the discourse, as I'm going to show it to you today among Jews, is actually often a lot more heterogeneous and nuanced than you'd find reflected in the public discourse, including within academia in Austria, which I think is interesting and problematic. Final note as well is that you'll see from the date stamps that we mostly conducted these interviews shortly before and after these October 7th attacks. So obviously we couldn't predict that October 7th was going to happen in the middle of our project, and I'm sure a lot of the positions might have changed by today, but still you can see this as a snapshot of an ongoing debate. I also personally think that the scale, the urgency, the tone of the debate might have changed a lot in the past year, but a lot of the issues that are talked about before and after October 7th are pretty consistent. Okay, so to dive straight in with the interviews, I mentioned this long-term development of anti-Semitism, there was a broad consensus among our interviewees that anti-Semitism is a constant in Austrian society throughout history, throughout all different forms of society, but that the forms and expression of anti-Semitism have changed. So just the anecdotes alone, right? The sort of experiences that people told us of things they've experienced that were anti-Semitic, you could fill many talks just with that itself. But just to sort of summarize that, for example, older interviewees remember the days shortly after the war when you still had surviving Nazis living in the country, when you had a later generation of neo-Nazis, that there was a much more open sort of racist anti-Semitism where people, Jewish people would be verbally abused, sometimes physically attacked in the streets. People would glorify, on the one hand, glorify, on the other hand, deny the Holocaust. They would express a desire for Austria to be free of Jews and so on. Today, that's changed in the sense that these kinds of views are officially tabooed in society, although still widely expressed on the far right. But, of course, these issues, really like physical attacks and so on, are more of a problem for visibly Jewish people, right? So, for example, Orthodox men who are who wear visible garb that identifies them as Jewish, or we've heard of men and women speaking Hebrew in the streets who've been attacked, for example. Having said that, though, whether you're visible or not, Jews also experience anti-Semitism, indirectly in a sense. So there's this phenomenon that's called anti-Semitism without Jews. So I'll give you an example. An interviewee recounted how their brother was called a dirty Jew on a night out, though the person saying this had no idea that the brother was Jewish, right? So you notice in that anecdote, Jew is just an insult. And that is anti-Semitic, clearly. But, it's a case where people can also be anti-Semitic even when it's not in a context where there are Jews around. Nevertheless, there is this broad consensus that anti-Semitism has become much more sort of implicit these days. It's much more subliminal, also because it's become more socially tabooed. And one of our interviewers actually compared this to the situation in the United States. If you think about political correctness today, that, for example, racism towards African Americans may be less vocalized today, but that doesn't mean it's less prevalent. So to quote, the quotes are in German, obviously, I'll translate them for you. Only when people are amongst themselves, i.e. amongst people who think like them, do they maybe say what they really think. So, while a social taboo might be welcome, clearly prejudice often remains very deep-seated and it remains present. So anti-Semitism may be more latent today, but it's often triggered by certain events. We saw this during COVID. And of course, every time there's an escalation in the Middle East conflict, certainly since October 7th. So as one interviewee summarized, when a certain situation arises, suddenly all come out of the woodwork, right? So all these prejudices start coming out when some event triggers it. So one point that was raised repeatedly by the interviewees was the conflation of all Jews as one homogenous group. I quote, "The most dangerous or biggest problem with anti-Semitism is that the Jews are always perceived as a singularity, like an anthill, right? And this talk of you and us," they said, so meaning always this idea of us and them, always sort of thinking in terms of these like very clearly defined groups. There's also a strong tendency to see Jews as foreigners, including conflating Jews worldwide with Israelis. So one interviewee told us, "One issue pervades throughout society, namely that Jews are not viewed as Austrians, me included. The first question is, are you from Israel? Because all Jews are seen as coming from Israel in Austria. So for most Austrians, it doesn't matter whether left, right, or whatever, an Austrian Jew is simply unimaginable. I find that anti-Semitic." Having said that, there is a conundrum then when other Jews, including official representative bodies, actually do exactly this conflation, right? So I have here a picture of the office building of the official Jewish community body in Vienna that routinely flies the Israeli flag whenever there's an escalation in the Middle East. So since October 7th, the Israeli flag has hung there pretty much the whole year. And at the same time, this organization insists on the IRA definition that conflating Jews with Israel is anti-Semitic. So you can imagine that for some non-Jews, that is a bit confusing. Notably, the conservative dominate parliament does the same thing. So here you see the parliament in Vienna sort of, lit up in the Israeli flags. I'm sort of compressing a very complex topic because of time reasons, but simply to say that there is a strong tendency in Austria to sort of link Holocaust commemoration and dealing with the Holocaust past with solidarity with the state of Israel. Of course, as I mentioned, even before October 7th, Israel was a key focal point in this entire discussion about anti-Semitism, and every escalation in the Middle East has led to a sort of rampant rise in this polarization. And that is not just about Israel, it's always also about Jews abroad and about this topic of anti-Semitism. It's interesting to note that many Jews, regardless of their opinions or feelings or connections to Israel, often cannot understand why so many people actually care so much about that topic. That's something that came up very often in the interviews, and that there's a very emotional interest among people all over the world who actually don't have any connection to the conflict. That's something that came up a lot too. Now, this is a development that certainly in recent times is clearly accelerated by social media. I mentioned earlier this idea of algorithmic radicalization. So speaking to an under 18 group, one of the interviewees said, they were talking about this For You function on TikTok. I personally don't have TikTok, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Some of you will. And they said this is probably put together by artificial intelligence and promotes arbitrary random things. And suddenly I see some random videos. Everyone come to the Palestine demonstration. That wasn't a one-off occurrence. It happens all the time. I left TikTok simply because I didn't want to hear about this topic anymore, simply because there are no informed people on that site, but just whatever random people. So the same interviewee emphasized how Israel-Palestine just comes up in any sort of random context. It doesn't matter. I quote, "It doesn't have to be related. Even if there is a report, say, about inflation in Austria, it's risen to 8% this month or whatever, you will still see 3 or 4 posts about how the leftist European media can't be trusted and free Palestine." So it's very well documented that the online sphere, and especially social media, is often targeted by activists and sometimes also by hostile states to spread disinformation with the specific aim of stoking divisions. But there's also a deeper problem here, the logic of social media platforms, which are, of course, also, enterprises, they're commercial, that they push popular sort of content that in themselves promote very divisive, polarized, and often very one-dimensional positions. So you get this sort of reduction of extremely complex issues to very simple moral imperatives like right and wrong, right? So another interviewee said, "Okay, the main thing is that you have an opinion on the matter. But when it comes to forming your opinion or perhaps listening to 2 sides of a debate, nope, that's too much effort." So in this context, there's also a widespread consensus among our interviewees that even before October 7th, this Israel topic in social media or in media generally was actually often a smokescreen for non-Jews to express anti-Semitic sentiments, whether latent or explicit, or to project other fears and concerns, for example, regarding the history of colonialism and imperialism. As one interviewee put it, "Well, it is quite clear that following the occupation, meaning of Palestinian territories after the 1967 war, the image of Israel changed, and for various reasons, Israel became a symbol of colonial crimes, of the colonial conqueror, and of the imperialist guilt of the West." Now, this is an interesting point when you consider, and I mean, I'm speaking also anecdotally here, but that I would say the sort of pro-Palestinian sentiment is especially strong in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, France as well, that obviously have a massive history of slavery, of settler colonialism, and crimes related to colonialism. Whereas in Austria, which is a former Nazi country, the kind of focus on Israel as an imperialist perpetrator is attractive for a different reason, right? It distracts from Holocaust memory. So another interviewee spoke about this, speaking about specifically the time after the 1967 war, which is seen as this big turning point in attitudes towards Israel. "I got the impression, and this was also the nature of the discussion at the time, that the role of the victim was in a sense handed over from the Jews to the Palestinians. The Palestinians were now the victims, no longer the Jews, and moreover, the Palestinians were the victims of Jewish perpetrators. And the whole question of the Holocaust was not really discussed, certainly not like in Germany. No one in Austria asked what their parents had done." Right? So there's this idea that you talk about Israel as a means to not have to talk about what happened in your own country very recently. Now, I really want to emphasize that this is not about, and this was also from a lot of our interviewees, this is not about weighing up, who suffered more in the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's also not about denying that Israel has committed war crimes towards Palestinians, and many interviewees also addressed this point. The point is rather, and I think this is a really interesting point, that the debates are often not actually about the Middle East. So this is a classic example of the politics of memory I was talking about earlier. So Israel really functions here as a kind of projection of other topics, and often functions in a way as an absolution of one's own guilt, be that sort of a colonial guilt that's felt in a country like the USA, or of Nazi guilt in Austria. So again, the interviewees emphasized repeatedly that Jews cannot be conflated with Israel. And of course, Jews, regardless of whatever relations to Israel they may have, do not hold sort of a homogenous view about, well, anything. Even within Israel, clearly, there's a very broad swathe of views and very critical views about Israeli government policies, including the occupation, for example. But at the same time, what became very clear in the interviews as well is that many, maybe most Jews do have some kinds of ties to Israel, and these might be familial, they might be religious, cultural, emotional. Certainly in Europe, there is a sense that Israel is a sort of safe haven, that if ever there were another sort of ideology like National Socialism that were to threaten Jews in Europe, that Israel would be a safe place. So when you think about movements like the boycott movement, it's a big debate whether it is anti-Semitic or not, but certainly among Jewish interviewees, it's sort of perceived explicitly or implicitly as anti-Semitic, simply because there is this demand that Jews actually cut themselves off, as one interviewee put it, from the present day center of Jewish life. So as what's sort of seen as being the sort of center of Jewish life. And I do want to comment as well that I find it ironic. I get this sense that the more rabid that anti-Israel discourse becomes, it probably actually strengthens sort of pro-Zionist views amongst Jewish people. And this became very apparent after October 7th. There was a sense that Jewish people in Europe as well, feel a need to sort of express more solidarity with Israel precisely because they perceive that it is under attack and that those attacks are essentially motivated by anti-Semitism. You can also notice that when you have, a sort of big rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, this is often linked to a rise in immigration to Israel, which is an interesting correlation. At the same time, almost all of our interviewees really emphasize that you need to protect free criticism, right? So that there needs to also be space to criticize Israeli actions or the actions of the Israeli government, the military. There was widespread support for this IRA definition that I mentioned, which I mean is problematic, but the support is rather there because there is an agreement that there needs to be a clear guideline, that you need to be able to sort of say, okay, this is clearly anti-Semitic, and at this point, this is not a discussion anymore, this is just being essentially racist. But again, that's very difficult to actually regulate in practice. So an interesting point is, I mentioned earlier this sort of idea that Israel is a colonial project. One of our interviewees cited a discussion with the Israeli sociologist Nathan Snyder. He said, of course it is colonialism. You could see it like that. You could approach it like that. You can say that. But then he also says, but it is also an anti-colonial movement. So what he was really getting at is that Zionism, it emerged as a liberation movement in Europe to liberate oppressed Jews. The problem then is that it became the source of a conflict where one group's liberation ends up sort of conflicting with another group's fundamental rights. And that's a very simplistic summary of the conflict. Most importantly, our interviewees emphasized that discussions in any case need to be based on arguments and facts. But that this debate, particularly when it comes to Israel, is usually led very ideologically. It's based on identitarian categories and moral absolutes that don't actually leave any room for real debate. So I mentioned the boycott movement already. This same interviewee said, it operates in a totally different universe. You cannot exchange even one word with them. So you may have witnessed this yourselves. You have activists who chant slogans like Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea, are often actually not interested in really debating their position. And for the interviewees, that's usually the point when this boundary is crossed, when they say, okay, then that's just being anti-Semitic. So you have similar discussions over terms like oppression. Apartheid is another big trigger. As another interviewee said, that is totally legitimate. Or maybe it isn't. We can debate this, right, without immediately resorting to calling the other person an anti-Semite. But even this interviewee said, for them, the line was absolutely drawn when it came to Israel with the common statement, Jews of all people should know better. Didn't they learn anything from the Holocaust? So, I mean, for Jews to hear this kind of comparison between the ongoing wars in the Middle East and the systematic extermination of entire populations of Jews in Europe is simply hurtful. And most importantly, it's an untrue comparison. That's a good example of, sort of trying to think, where is reasonable debate, and at what point do you cross the line when you say this is just not based in facts anymore? But beyond that, there is no really clear agreement on where this boundary lies. Between legitimate criticism and anti-Semitic hate speech. But what's interesting is that the broader public, and as I've mentioned, mostly non-Jewish discourse in Austria is often actually much stricter in sort of making this definition, decrying what counts as anti-Semitism, than our Jewish interviewees did this. So this brings me on to the second part of the perspectives on the discourse. I mentioned earlier that there's been this strong shift through successive conservative governments of addressing and legislating against anti-Semitism, and this is usually combined with debates about the Middle East conflict, wherein the Austrian government has usually taken a very strong pro-Israel stance. So previously, the situation was that anti-Semitism was very much a problem of the right, and that meant that the Jewish population typically was quite suspicious of the right wing in Austria. And we had a massive refugee crisis in 2015. There have been ongoing escalations in the Middle East conflict. This has been a big turning point. And now the conservative government is actually has quite close relations with the Jewish community. When I say community, I really mean more like the organization, not necessarily Jews as individuals. This has been particularly sort of linked to the government's discussion of what they call imported anti-Semitism, this idea that anti-Semitism is a problem that's imported into Austria by foreigners, which I think just historically alone is just complete nonsense, but okay. So in any case, the opinions on these right-wing initiatives among our interviewees were divided. There was some positive. So one interviewee was speaking about Caroline Edstadler. She's a government minister and a very hardline protege of the former Chancellor Kurz, who I mentioned earlier. And this interviewee said, "Since Edstadler has been in office, fantastic. I mean, you can really feel how you have this enormous support, how someone has your back." When we asked the interviewee how they felt about the sort of repeated coalitions between her party and, rabid anti-Semites, they said, "There are very many political discussions where you simply think they were totally on our side every time, our side meaning the Jews. And then they coalition with the biggest idiots in the world. But the question is, does she have another choice?" Meaning Caroline Edstadler. Now, I personally think, yes, she does have another choice. I mean, it is a choice when you enter into a coalition with radicals and anti-democratic extremists. Okay. But as this interviewee also said at the end, they are politicians. What do you expect? And then they laughed. Other interviewees were more critical, for example, addressing how engagements with anti-Semitism, of course, they are positive, right? The fact that the government is taking these steps is positive, but sort of dubious when considering why are they taking these steps. So speaking about the former Chancellor Kurz, who you see here with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, so there you have a xenophobic right-wing populist who at the same time, the interview then didn't finish this thought, but was clearly speaking about the sort of commemorating the Holocaust and showing support for Israel, and then continued, obviously something has changed. And the critical conclusion was the Jews are now being instrumentalized for some other purpose. So many interviewees were also quite skeptical about the repeated practice of raising the Israeli flag from government buildings in Austria. That's the chancellery there after October 7th. You just need to add here that Austria is a neutral state and has been quite problematic in its neutrality in a lot of international conflict situations, except when it comes to Israel. One of our interviewees called this practice, this sort of raising the Israeli flag, a clear instrumentalization, and went on, "I don't think they care at all about Israel. They're rather concerned with the narrative. Look how pro-Jewish we are." And then they went on to summarize how they saw the government strategy. "I mention anti-Semitism when it is pertinent to do so, but then I support those, meaning the far right, who keep me in power, no matter how. And if they use anti-Semitism to keep me in power, then great. The main thing is that I stay in power. I find that simply terrible." Other interviewees called this raising of the Israeli flag merely performative and for show. Some of them pointed out that the Austrian government actually doesn't send aid or weapons to Israel, so it really is just sort of a gesture. And there was also an interesting thought that this sort of very performative pro-Israeli stance is actually counterproductive. That's a quote, counterproductive, because it puts an uncomfortable spotlight on Jews in Austria, right? And actually deepens a lot of already existing social tensions surrounding the Middle East conflict within Austria. So there were thoughts expressed that a serious engagement with anti-Semitism would mean much more practical support, for example, funding schools, synagogues, and Jewish life in Austria, rather than just raising the Israeli flag. Some of the interviewees also explicitly criticized the government policy of vilifying immigrants and refugees as ostensible anti-Semites, a narrative that since October 7th especially has been pushed very strongly by the Austrian media. There is an acknowledgement that anti-Semitism is an issue also among recent immigrants from the Middle East. As I said from the outset, it is something that you find across all social groups. But as one interviewee put it, stoking xenophobia achieves nothing, right? It deepens very strong social divisions. That's basically what it achieves. So when asked about the intention behind this pro-Israel stance of the right-wing government, one interviewee who was otherwise quite positive about this government said, yes, but I think they're doing all this to get rid of the refugees and the new arrivals. And when we asked whether these same right-wing politicians wouldn't be anti-Semitic if there were no Muslims to persecute, they responded, of course. As soon as they, i.e. Muslims and refugees, are gone, then it'll be our turn again. So that's certainty, that's our history. Another interview discussed this thought at length. You cannot condemn this conservative government to 100% for taking the Holocaust seriously and putting up monuments and being against anti-Semitism. Of course, that's positive. But why are they doing this? Are they doing it just because they're good people, or are they pursuing other goals? What is this really about? This interviewee concluded that Austria is a country that, quote, on the one hand, very Islamophobic, and on the other, anti-Semitic, and then the one group is played off against the other. Oops. Yes, it's the same interviewee then also mused about, sort of a little bit ironically, about this pro-Israel position. They said, I think the biggest worry for Austrians and Germans is if the state of Israel actually collapsed and all the Jews came back. As such, one has to support Israel so that the Jews don't come back. One of our interviews pointed out the international dimension of this new right-wing pro-Israel stance that is pursued by populists and far-right politicians across Europe, and concluded, it's totally clear that it's because their common enemy is Muslims, right? Doesn't matter whether in France or in the Netherlands or in Austria. One interviewee pointed out that the right-wing parties are themselves often anti-feminist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, until the topic is Islam, and then suddenly these same right-wing politicians criticize Muslims collectively for apparently being anti-feminist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic. Another interviewee summarized this politics, well, it's not credible, and that's putting it politely. You can't claim to be against racism and anti-Semitism, and at the same time, let me put it like this. First, you want power, then you want money, and then you want 20 other things, and then you want 30 other things. And then eventually, oh yes, I'm also against anti-Semitism, right? It goes something like that. And to me, that has zero value and zero credibility. Various of our interviews called this a fig leaf politics or a strategy of divide and conquer. So in other words, far-right politicians are using Israel and anti-Semitism as a diversion tactic from what is really their own racist politics. So they make Muslims and refugees solely responsible for this problem of anti-Semitism. And these coalitions, right, between conservatives and the far right, they came up just time and again in the interviews in this context, with most of our interviews finding these coalitions pretty outrageous and more importantly to them, damaging to the Jewish population and to Austrian society generally, because it really is just stoking division. So 2 weeks ago, the far right in Austria won a landslide on a platform of remigration. I don't know if you've heard this term in the States. This is basically the idea, what they're talking about is basically deportation, of taking everyone who's sort of seen as being foreign, immigrant, asylum seekers, anyone who's seen as hostile or alien, and deporting them from the country. And our interviewers were quite aware that if this ludicrous, insane plan were to succeed, that you deport all these foreigners, then frankly, Jews would be next. That brings me to the final part. So as I mentioned from the outset, various polls internationally as well reveal that prejudices rarely occur in isolation. So people who tend to be hateful of one group tend to hate other groups as well. So there is a clear connection between anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, to name some of the most obvious forms of hate. This came up in our under 18s group interview as well. Quote, I think Austrian anti-Semites don't like Muslims either. I think they frequently generally don't like whatever isn't Austrian or German or European or typically Western. Maybe their hatred of Jews is still greater than their racism towards Islam or whatever, but in principle, they probably don't like either side. So a really common thread you find that connects anti-Semitism and other forms of hate speech is conspiracy. There is this idea that anti-Semitism is like a core ideology that underlies conspiracy narratives. So you might have seen this during COVID, and I mentioned earlier the Great Replacement conspiracy narrative. So this is this idea that there are powerful Jews who are conspiring to flood Western countries with Muslim refugees and immigrants, and thereby sort of destroying white society. That's basically it. And you see there clearly how these two forms, right, this anti-Semitism and racism, are connected. And that's also seen on the level of misogyny and homophobia, particularly in Eastern Europe. You find that women's emancipation, gay rights, transgender identities, and so on are framed as sort of being pushed by these, again, like powerful Jews who undermine real men and women. And again, the idea is that this is sort of destroying the real people, the white race. So these might sound completely ludicrous as theories, but they lead to very real life violence. So if you remember in 2011, a far-right extremist massacred scores of social democratic youths in Oslo, Norway. In 2019, as I mentioned, the far-right extremist massacred 51 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. In 2022, far-right extremists massacred 10 African-American shoppers in Buffalo, New York. And also in 2022, a far-right extremist massacred 2 LGBT-identifying men outside a gay bar in Bratislava in Slovakia. So these victims I just mentioned were targeted for political views, skin color, religion, and gender or sexual identity. But the common thread to all of these attacks was this anti-Semitic conspiracy narrative of the Great Replacement. Every single one of those perpetrators had published a sort of manifesto where they outlined their worldview that it was powerful Jews who were responsible for these evils they were attacking. And if you remember the obvious, I mean, explicitly anti-Semitic attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, during which 11 Jews were killed, this was also motivated, in the perpetrator's own words, by his belief in the Great Replacement. So he was punishing Jews for subverting the white race through, immigration and LGBT rights and so on. So this sort of connects, this question of similarities and differences between anti-Semitism and other forms of hate is a quite hotly debated, sometimes controversial issue. And sure enough, our interviewees did see that anti-Semitism is in many ways unique. And there was also a feeling that often anti-racism campaigners are sometimes blind to their own anti-Semitism because they aren't able to see those differences. But as one interviewee summarized, because anti-Semitism has a unique aspect, it has to be, this person was criticizing that, the thought that because anti-Semitism is a unique aspect, it has to be regarded in isolation. In my opinion, this is a mistake that many Jewish organizations also make. I cannot combat anti-Semitism and accept racism and homophobia and xenophobia implicitly. So as mentioned repeatedly, a lot of interviewees sort of expressed this view that these politics in Austria have a kind of divide and conquer function, and that ultimately could fall back on Jews as well, because, as said, racists at heart tend to also be anti-Semitic. I'm going to raise some sensitive issues now. Of course, the fact that Jews can themselves also hold hardline positions. They can make factually inaccurate statements, and they can spread disinformation. And this did occur in our interviews as well. So for example, there was an interviewee who responded to the common anti-Israel statements that there never historically was a place called Israel, or simply you stole our land, with the statement, this has been our land for 3,000 years. So, okay, very complex issues of who is meant by we and how land ownership is conceived and managed for a 3,000-year period. But this statement in its simplicity, implying that there was this continuous Jewish sovereignty over the Holy Land for 3 millennia is simply false. Similarly, in our over 18s group interview, one interviewee described Palestinians as, quote, this population group that were actually a tribe, sort of like nomads in Jordan, and they were expelled by Jordan, and they're not taken in by Egypt. And then they basically had this refugee status until they simply ended up in Gaza and the West Bank, and through their history up until now, they have basically established a national identity. Okay, while Palestinian national identity, notably like Israeli national identity, like any national identity, is genuinely of quite recent provenance. Again, this is really sort of misrepresenting the situation. The current residents of Gaza and West Bank either lived there before Israel was established, or they are the descendants of people who fled or were expelled from the territory of what is now Israel. So these are instances of disinformation in the other way. But I want to also draw attention to the fact that this interviewee said this entirely without hate, right? This was in fact being cited as sort of sympathy, having sympathy for the Palestinian situation, but it still remains untrue, and as such, it is harmful. So I'm highlighting this just to say that in these sort of polarized debates, when things are sort of reduced to two sides, like pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, yeah, disinformation becomes a very big issue. An even more sensitive issue is the fact that Jews can, of course, also be racist, because being subjected to one form of hate doesn't inoculate anyone from perpetuating other forms of hate. And that also came up in our project. So in 2020, there was a terrorist attack in Vienna during which a lone Muslim gunman massacred 4 people, about which one of our interviewees stated, "Since the attack in the city center a couple of years ago, everyone's eyes have suddenly been opened. 1,000 times we told them, we being the Jews, them being non-Jewish Austrians, listen, those people, meaning Muslims, are barbarians. Those are people who have no shame about anything. They will simply go around and shoot at everything." And they managed to do precisely that here in Vienna. So, to repeat, this was a lone gunman in an actually quite isolated incident for Austria. And actually, one of the 4 victims was himself a Muslim Austrian. And as is widely reported in media, a lot of bystanders were saved by others who were Muslims, because again, there are a lot of Muslims who live in Vienna. It's also, I think, important to say that these kinds of hate ideologies are always an attack on an open society, right? They're not an attack on one group or another, usually. So we had a couple of interviewees voice similar prejudices, for example, about the role of women in Islam, which was an ironic sort of projection when what had come up was sort of similar prejudices about Orthodox Jews, and they simply projected these onto Muslims. Similarly, in a way that the far right sort of projects their, misogyny onto Muslims collectively, or sort of, there were claims that Muslims do not integrate properly, which again, if this charge is made against Orthodox Jews, for example, that would rightly be called anti-Semitic. As this interviewee also said, with no sense of self-irony, "Assimilate yourself, sweetheart. We're not in Turkey here, we're in Vienna." Now, I want to point out that there has also been a massive rise in anti-Muslim racism in Austria in recent years, which has also significantly risen since October 7th. This is well documented, even if not very widely discussed in public discourse at the moment. It comprises hate speech online and offline. That includes calls to violence and murder, racist graffiti targeting Muslim homes and community centers. There have been threats made to mosques, and a widespread culture of denunciation in schools and politics and media, demanding that individual Muslims of any background, religious or not, that they distance themselves from Hamas or from radical Islam, while at the same time, there is a common view, which again, I agree with, that if you were to ask any sort of Jewish individual to distance themselves from Israel, that would be anti-Semitic. An alarming feature of a lot of anti-Muslim racism by comparison to anti-Semitic incidents is that in over 10% of the anti-Muslim documented cases, they were perpetrated by civil servants, predominantly police officers. So coming back to this national strategy against anti-Semitism, I think it's quite alarming, and it's something that some anti-racism campaigners are talking about, that the government's pushing this strong anti-Semitism policy, but clearly has no intention of actually implementing the EU-mandated strategy on racism. So this is just a sort of snapshot, but yeah, much of the public discourse really just turns quite a blind eye to what are really quite parallel developments in this sense, and focus almost exclusively on anti-Semitism. Since October 7th, there was such an explosion of reports that we weren't even able to document. We gave up at some point. What we did also document, though, is that you have this sort of flood of discussions about anti-Semitism, and when you go into the comments and the way these are shared in social media, they were accompanied by an absolute flood of really hateful anti-Muslim invective. And that brings me back to the landslide victory of the far right 2 weeks ago. You also need to see that in this light. So it's interesting that when you look at social workers who work a lot, for example, with Muslim youth, talk about the effects of sort of mass vilification and alienation on these young people's sort of identity, that if anything, it probably makes young people more susceptible to radical ideologies, particularly through social media. So in other words, this discourse, as I've sort of outlined it today, is probably fueling the very development of polarization and radicalization that it often claims to be fighting against. So I'm coming to the end now. I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but any of you who hasn't sort of engaged with this debate, I don't just mean this book in itself, but the whole debate around multidirectional memory, it is very interesting. It essentially points out that, we live in a very diverse and globalized world where you have many different people from different backgrounds who are embedded in often very different historical experiences and memory cultures. So while you don't necessarily have to accept every viewpoint, it is essential to understand that people are coming literally and figuratively from different places, right? To understand their perspectives. And that, you're only going to start achieving a kind of common ground when you actually accept that to start with. And this has come up in the Austrian discourse as well. So Isabel Frey is a Jewish Austrian musician and activist. She's a member of a Jewish-Palestinian solidarity group. The title of this article, which was published after October 7th, reads, "Jewish and Palestinian traumas must be allowed to coexist." In this article, she pointed out that it has become controversial in Austria to even call for peace, right? While, for example, Palestinian Austrians expressing mourning for killed family members in the war or criticizing occupation policies are immediately decried as anti-Semitic or as supporting Hamas. Frey pointed out that understanding does not mean placing everything on the same level, right? So the Holocaust against Jews is not the same as the Nakba against Palestinians. And also understanding that people come from different perspectives doesn't mean you have to legitimize every point of view or agree with it. But again, it's this idea that you need to allow space for people's different experiences. And she closed by pointing out, and I think this is again a very important point in this context, that in this kind of extremely polarized environment, it is much easier for a lot of people to simply choose one side. And in that sense, it's almost irrelevant which side you choose, right? You just have your one side and that's the right side, and rah, 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 that's, it's a way that you just completely obviate the need to sort of engage with the complexity of historical conflicts. And I think it's sad that a view like this is actually quite marginal in Austria at the moment. So this also it came up in our interview sort of implicitly as well, this sort of multidirectional memory idea. So for example, when interviewees questioned the political and historical motives for why particular groups would express solidarity with specific other groups in other contexts. So one interviewee addressed the growing popularity of wearing the kufiya, the Palestinian scarf in Austria in the 1990s in a post-Nazi country where there's a rampant anti-Semitism problem, and said, but those were always these really, really blonde white people who wore these things. And so I always asked myself, are they concerned about the Palestinians, or is this really about the Jews? There is an obvious parallel here, I think, to the discussions. I'm going to come to the end, yes. On American campuses in the past year, this question of who takes which side and why. Laura's rushing me to finish, so I will hurry up. In a sentence, I mean, there's a real problem of reducing these things to moral absolutes and then vilifying other sides, right? It actually, if anything, it prolongs and feeds such conflicts. The sociologist Nathan Snyder I mentioned earlier, he discusses multidirectional memory with specific regard to the Middle East conflict. And I think his point is very concise and astute. He said, if human rights do not apply to all humans, then they are not actually human rights. I think that's a very good point. So yeah, I want to quote very quickly one of the interviewees who said, a debate requires two sides, or not even two. It usually requires 1,000 sides. If you don't allow this, you don't really want a debate. So I had some more notes, but I think I've made my point. I would like to close with a nice optimistic quote, because this has been quite a dire talk, by the great Italian author Italo Calvino, which I find personally very inspirational in the face of so many conflicts in the world. And I invite you to reflect on this as I close. on this horrendous discourse. The inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here, the inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what, in the midst of inferno, are not inferno, then make them endure, give them space. Thank you.
Let's stop sharing so we can see each other. Can you stop sharing? Where's the, we need to pull this up. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was. Yeah, now it's on. I think those of you who heard me maybe at home, really a lot to think about. And I want to begin by giving people in the audience a chance to ask questions. If we still have time after that, I will see if people want to chat in a question. But is there anyone who has a question for Dr. Corbett about anything that you heard specifically, or about anything that this talk made you think about? Give people a moment. I know I have questions. Any questions in relation? Jess?
Okay, so the question, I'll repeat it for people who are listening online. The question is how the Austrian government's pro-Israel approach is tied to the rise of Netanyahu. I am not a political scientist. I am not a diplomatic historian. But there is clearly a connection, and that did come up. I mean, there is a lot more in these interviews and in all our data than I was able to present, even though this was a relatively long talk. And that did come up as well. And I think there is just a very widespread international far-right alliance emerging, which is very disturbing. And it seems almost bizarre because the far-right movements in different countries are often in many ways kind of opposed to each other. They're very nationalist in their thinking. So it seems weird that they become so transnational, but I think it's because they bolster each other. And I think certainly if you reduce, for example, the Middle East conflict to a conflict between Jews and Muslims, and you reduce anti-Semitism to essentially a Muslim problem, which is what a lot of Austrian politicians and the media are trying to suggest currently, then of course you ally yourself with Netanyahu. And conversely, I mean, I don't want to get into a debate what I think about the ongoing wars at the moment, but, you know, there has been a very hardline response by this current administration or repeated Netanyahu administrations. And I think that's something that is admired by the right wing in Europe. And it's an approach that is seen as being worthy of being emulated in Europe. So the question was whether there are Holocaust deniers among these far right, I assume you mean. Yeah, it's so complicated because the far right can be quite contradictory in that way too. So on the one hand, they might suggest that the Holocaust was entirely made up, which in itself fits a certain anti-Semitic trope that Jews deliberately made this up so that they could, you know, claim restitution payments and so on. Or sort of, you know, pressure people into supporting Israel. That's quite a common trope. And at the same time, there are people who celebrate the Holocaust. So there is a politician currently in office in Lower Austria who is part of a student fraternity who talks about gassing the 7th million. They have a song about that. That was quite a big scandal, but that didn't stop the conservatives coalitioning with him. You know, it's sort of a weird mix. I think, yeah, you have Holocaust denial among some, but I think it's almost irrelevant because also a lot of far right, I mean, they don't think it's something necessarily to be ashamed of, or the Holocaust is now 80 years ago. There's also a feeling that's like, okay, this is done. We shouldn't be talking about this. And this shift actually to talking about Muslims, I think, is part of that as well. Because there's this view, I mean, there are like 10,000 Jews in Austria. I think for some in the far right, they're like, this isn't really a problem anymore, which is horrific when you think about it. Okay, what led to the rise of the far right is, again, I'm not a political scientist. There is a wonderful discourse analyst in Austria called Ruth Wodak. And if you want to look her up, she's amazing and has been documenting this for many years. She is, in fact, the daughter of Holocaust survivors herself. And I think part of it is the way that the far right has been able to harness crises, right? So we had a financial crisis, we had the COVID crisis, energy crisis, climate crisis, all these sort of multiple crises, and they're able to stoke fear and push scapegoat narratives. That's a fairly, I'm very much simplifying the answer here. That's certainly part of it. And another thing that I think is very worrying is what Ruth Wodak calls shameless normalization. This is when you say something that is outrageous. You can see Donald Trump doing this all the time. Sorry to dive right in with the American example, but it's one that I think you will all be familiar with. You say something that causes absolute outrage, but when you've said it once, the next time you say it, it's not so outrageous anymore. And then more people say it and more. And this kind of is a process. And when you look at the conservatives in Austria today, the conservatives, right, not the far right, they have a program that 30 years ago was far right. So the far right across Europe and maybe in the States as well has managed to push the entire discourse further to the right, and every other party kind of follows. So immigration is another one, where even left-wing parties now feel that, everybody needs to talk about immigration. And sure, it's an important issue, but I think that also explains it partly. And it's a very dangerous development. It's a very dangerous tactic when conservatives especially then think that the answer is to, they feel like they need to speak to the voters who are, voting for the far right by then adopting far right positions. But that only strengthens the far right further. So the fact that the Freedom Party has now come out as the first time since the Nazis were in power as the #1 party shows what happens when you sort of normalize their topics of debate. I hope that answers the question. These are really complicated issues.
Who were, bringing people in to testify, right, and sort of condemning people for anti-Semitism, are often the same people who want to create an example where, Christian prayer is imposed in schools, right, or just to name one example, or in some cases, the same people who may be dining with open, anti-Semites and things like that. So it's very striking, sort of instrumentalization on both sides. I wanted to ask you, I know you said that the interviews were anonymized. If you saw in your particular interviews, if you saw an age difference between attitudes Israel and anti-Semitism, because older here lived at a time where the situation that right now was not always the case. Were you able to know anything?
So the question is about the sociological background of the interviewees. I mean, I'll tread carefully there because there was a good reason why we decided to anonymize them. But I think very broadly, yeah, of course there were differences. That's why I made a point of mentioning that in the beginning, that even though we had a relatively small number, though I will add that the interviews themselves were over 24 hours of material, which when transcribed were the length of a book. So it is a lot of material, right? But we did try to sort of get a somewhat representative spread of people because Jews are obviously diverse people, they're not a homogenous group. Yeah, and for sure there were differences. I mean, I think I can name some without compromising anonymity, but for example, older ones who tended to refer things much more back to far right, to Nazi ideology, to racist anti-Semitism. And younger people who are maybe more sensitive to the issues of Muslim anti-Semitism, because there is anti-Semitism among Muslims. I mean, that is also a thing, I'm not denying that. And yeah, with this sort of relation to Israel, I think is an interesting one too. But yeah, it's very difficult to make sort of sweeping statements. I do think that attitudes to Israel globally have changed. I think that's pretty well documented, and that's probably true of Jewish people as well, that maybe younger Jewish people today feel differently one way or the other. I don't want to really commit myself to saying more than that. Shameless normalization. Thank you. So the question of this is being published, yes, we plan a few articles. We originally were talking about doing a book. For various reasons, we're not going to do a book. I mean, it's such a saturated topic at the moment, but of course, we're going to publish a few articles. I have one that's appearing in English, probably will be published in the States, actually, where I'll be talking much more about the sort of Israel-Palestine discourse. I have another one appearing, unfortunately, in German. I don't know who reads German here. That will be talking more about the politics, as I've discussed today. My colleague will also be publishing in a media journal about the social media dimension. So that was really one of the main focuses we actually had, was the online sphere, because that's such a major issue right now, not just with anti-Semitism, but generally with disinformation and hate speech. But I've personally moved more away from that focus. My colleague will be publishing on that as well. Do you mind if I answer before I forget? Sure. That I'll answer the first question first? Okay. See, I'm already beginning to. So the first was about standing together and about, creating dialogue. That is a very interesting question. And there are initiatives like that also in Austria, and they're just being suffocated by not being given much attention. So after October 7th, the Jewish Community Organization has repeatedly organized what can only really be described as very pro-Israel rallies, which, I mean, I don't know where to go with that. And concurrently, there were some smaller pro-Palestine rallies that were perceived as being pro-Hamas. To me, all of that was part of that problem of, again, dividing everything into sort of two camps. And at the same time, so Isabel Frey, who I mentioned, is part of a group who has weekly been holding candlelit vigils by a broad sort of coalition. And these are not just Jews and Palestinians. There were also, for example, Kurds and other groups of people who had been sort of, had experienced violence, political violence, and so on. And it was a very apolitical event in the sense that their whole point was, this isn't about pushing a certain political narrative. It's about acknowledging and recognizing that people are being killed and that is a bad thing. And it's incredible that, I mean, that has barely been reported on in the Austrian media, and it's sometimes even vilified because it's seen as sort of falsely equating, different sides. And it's problematic. I'm sorry, I'm taking my time with this answer, but because it is an interesting question. I think partly in these interviews, a whole part of the interviews that I couldn't go into today was also asking more productively, what can you do? What works? What are viable solutions to these problems? And one thing you do find is that encounters really make a big difference, because a lot of hate is about abstraction. You think in terms of groups in really abstract ways. And anti-Semitism is absolutely a good example of that. I think in a country where you only have 10,000 Jews, a lot of people have never even met a Jew, but they might still be very anti-Semitic. And obviously meeting people and actually knowing people changes that. So what's very widely publicized in Austria is that there is a Jewish organization who does sort of encounter work where Jewish kids go to schools, and the idea is they really are school kids themselves and chat to peers. And this is shown to work, that it really does help deconstruct people's prejudices. What's sad is that there was a similar initiative by a Muslim student organization a few years ago, a really great initiative. And again, that's just not really, it's just not talked about. It's not given oxygen, and I think, again, that needs to be something that happens in multiple directions. Sorry, I took a very long time, but yes, I think absolutely. And in the end, yeah, it's very problematic when you have a kind of dialogue. Well, it's not even dialogue, is it? You have a discourse, again, to stick with that word, that sort of wants to reduce everything to one side of a problem without sort of showing. Okay, I'll leave it there. Mm-hmm. So the question about the Israeli flag and how complicated it is, and I completely agree. I think, of course, it's very, and again, I mean, I could have given you so much more just on that. I mean, there were cases, for example, the Pride Parade in Vienna this year, there was uproar because a labor Zionist youth group wanted to march with the flag, and then there were sort of pro-Palestinian activists who wanted to block them from doing so. And there's this feeling, again, for Jews being, cannot emphasize this enough, being such a tiny minority, and the remnants of a group who were subject to genocide, feeling like they're the only group who don't get to have their flag, right, at a parade that is replete with flags of all kinds of different movements and so on. And so, of course, for a lot of Jewish people, the Israeli flag is not just a kind of national flag. I, absolutely agree. Nonetheless, I mean, when you fly it from a federal building in the context of an international war, it is a political and diplomatic issue. And Austria, I mean, again, it all gets very complicated, but Austria refuses to join NATO. The neutrality thing is a big thing in Austria, and it's a very controversial debate. Austria had very controversial positions on Russia and Ukraine, but has no problems flying the Israeli flag when it comes to, war in the Middle East. So I think that's really more the framework. But I think also it's so problematic. Of course, no Jewish person should feel threatened to show the Israeli flag? Because again, what does it mean to show the Israeli flag? Does that mean you support war? Does that mean you support settlement construction in occupied territories? No, I mean, it doesn't really mean much other than maybe that you're expressing a Jewish identity at first and foremost, you know. Sorry, I paused because I kind of lost my train of thought as well, but I was going to say there as well. I think the problem as well is that we find ourselves at a time when, for example, when we say, okay, there is anti-Semitism among Muslims, for a lot of Muslims who hold anti-Semitic views, some of this, I mean, is very clearly related to Israel. And when you have this idea that Israel speaks for all Jews and that all Jews are connected to Israel, that in itself is part of the problem. And when the Austrian government then pushes that further, you know, they insist on the one hand that it's anti-Semitic to conflate Jews with Israel, and then actually they do that themselves. And I think that's the problem. And they also implicitly or explicitly push the idea that ultimately there is this intractable conflict between Jews and Muslims, which, you know, Laura and I were talking about that this afternoon in terms of Holocaust history. Is just simply not true, right? Sorry, that was where I was going with that as well. It's really complicated. How do you show this solidarity without necessarily using a national flag? It's complicated for sure, but I remain very skeptical about how it's done. That's what I want to say.
So hopefully this connected. I want to thank our speakers so much for that. Thank you, and I look forward, you know, when the article is published, I will make sure I get it, and if anyone is interested, I will get it to you. Thank you and good night. Thank you so much. I'll see you on Wednesday.
You want us to send it or bring it in?
You can send this.
Oh, and then that was so what do you think?
Take care.
Well,
Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming. Wait.